The importance of things like trademarks or getting trade secrets or copyright protection, it's all very different depending on the business the company's getting into.
How do you think about guiding founders through the unique legal and regulatory challenges in these sectors compared to, say, traditional software companies?
I mean, it doesn't sound like you're a technology company if you don't have, any IP you're trying to protect. If you're going to end up doing an asset sale or something at the end, it could certainly make it more attractive.
It's obviously difficult to get one patent, and that takes time and obviously money and effort. Is it worth doing this overarching one that's a bigger vision that encompasses everything else? Is that even feasible? Is that possible?
Say obtaining a patent can take a long time, and its lifespan could be 20 years from the date you file it. So you might want to think about, if you're an investor, potential investor, you can at least look at that and read through the patent and make an evaluation.
Ryan, what fuels your mornings? Coffee, tea, or something else?
Well, I stopped drinking caffeine about a year ago, so now I'm on to herbal tea and water for the most part. So it's been a rough transition, but herbal tea now is what fuels me.
You must have gone through some crazy caffeine headaches, like from the withdrawal.
I think the first week I did feel like I was making a very bad decision and I needed to go back to coffee, but eventually I kind of acclimated a little bit. So
I bet.
Don't recommend it though.
Yeah, I bet. When you were a kid, what did you think you'd grow up to be?
I think I did want to be on work on the Starship Enterprise and go to Starfleet Academy. Unfortunately, technology did not catch up with my dreams, and so I decided to pivot to something else.
And here we are.
Here we are.
What's one technology that you can't live without?
I think cars would be my thing. I think it would be, and I was thinking about this too, because I think most technologies I feel like I could live without, but I think it'd be hard to give up being able to drive somewhere for different things and always have to bike or walk.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, you'd be so limited to where you can go, really. Huh?
I'd be very, very limited. Exactly.
Yeah. If you could fast forward 10 years and see one impact that the work you've been doing has made to the world, what would you want that to be?
Well, as a lawyer, what I feel like is there's little widespread impact that us lawyers end up having overall, especially if you're working at a law firm, let's say, for the most part. But I think the impact you do have is with the individuals. So I know that there will be several people who say, yeah, this lawsuit we were involved in, this was a pivotal moment in our company's history. And so they definitely remember those pretty well. So when I've met with clients, years after their big dispute, they always remember them really well, sometimes more than I will remember them, because for them it was this, huge moment.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, look, everyone, welcome to Machine Minds. I'm your host, Greg Terrusian, founder of Samson Rose, your robotics talent search partner. And on today's episode, I'm joined by Ryan Smith, partner at Wilson Sonsini. Thanks for being on the show today, Ryan.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Pleasure. Let's jump into it. So you specialize in patents, primarily in the litigation context, and you built your career at Wilson Sonsini, one of the most recognized law firms in tech and life sciences. Can you take us back and tell us how you even got into this field and where it all started?
Well, Greg, so I was going to the University of Washington. I was majoring in electrical engineering, and I thought I was going to be an engineer. And so I had fortunately got a job at a startup company, and this was back in the late 1990s. So it was kind of the internet boom of that time. And I was working at this company as basically an intern. And at some point, it was a technology company. So at some point, my boss came and told me, "Hey, Ryan, we need to come up with a patent strategy for the company." And he handed me some of the block diagrams that were depicting our overall technology. And he wanted me to go out and basically interview lawyers, try to come up with whatever kind of patent strategy we're going to have. And I was kind of surprised that I was getting this project. I had no idea what to do. And it started leading me down this path of being interested in patents and intellectual property in general. And I was really interested in some of the questions about why do companies, why would we be getting patents? Why would we be spending this money on it? Why do companies do it in general? And that was really interesting. So I started looking into this. I actually talked to a lot of IP attorneys, basically by just cold calling them and seeing if they wanted to come in, potentially work on this project for the company. And eventually I got interested enough that I decided to take a hard look at going to law school. So then I went to law school, and I knew I wanted to work for a law firm that worked with, I would say, innovative companies in technology. And I found Wilson, which was in the Bay Area, and went to that law firm. I've been here ever since. So I've now been here for almost 22 years.
Oh, wow. And what appeals to you about the patent side of things of emerging technologies?
I think the most interesting thing about this, and I guess is one reason why I like podcasts like yours, where you talk to mostly interesting founders about their companies, is that's one part of our job, is to actually talk to these companies, understand what they do. And I feel like I've been exposed to so many different interesting ideas that people have had, things I never would have thought about in my wildest dreams. And I think that's the most fun, is to actually learn about what these companies do and maybe participate a little bit in and help them in some ways through their life cycle. So I think that's been the funnest part of the job.
Great learning about this stuff. I mean, like you said, some of the stuff I hear about, and we were just talking about another episode before we hit recording, you can't even get your head around it, or you would like, how did they even come up with these ideas? And it's just fascinating to learn about and speak to these super smart people building crazy technology. So
crazy technology, or even innovating on things like that we just take for granted. Like a company that's saying, I'm going to do something amazing with dental floss. Right. You just like, whoa, dental floss. I didn't know anybody could improve on that, but it turns out, maybe you could. That's just an example, throwing it out there. But I mean, those are the sort of things I feel like I've been exposed to and learned about that are just amazing. So there's just so many amazing people that are doing fascinating things.
Can you give listeners an overview of the firm's role in supporting tech companies?
So Wilson Sonsini, its mandate from really when the current incarnation of this firm started in the late 1970s was to be a partner for technology companies and life sciences companies from the onset of the company. So the idea being that, hey, we work with founders from day one, and then continue to work with them through incorporating the company, doing different financing, hopefully doing some successful sale of the company or an IPO. Our firm has done more tech IPOs than any other law firm. And some of the biggest ones, I think early on, what the firm got some notoriety for was they did the Apple's IPO, and I think it was something in like 1980 or thereabouts. And then through the years, just many other companies. I think, like, Google, for example. And those are, at least Google is a good example of a company that our firm had worked with from the very, very beginning and continues to work for to this day. And I think what's so fun about that too is you really get to having all that history about the client, and then seeing them succeed is quite fun.
Nice. How do you think about guiding founders through the unique legal and regulatory challenges in these sectors compared to, say, traditional software companies?
Well, I would certainly say, from maybe an IP perspective, which is kind of the perspective I provide expertise on, is I think all of these different companies and these different markets are so different that patent, let's say whether to have a patent strategy, file for patents, the importance of things like trademarks or getting trade secrets or copyright protection. It's all very different depending on the business the company's getting into. So, I mean, you could be coming from, let's say, a prior company that did, let's say, SaaS software, and you're in trying to apply that same strategy to a company that's in the robotics field isn't necessarily going to work. And so I think you really have to start from the very beginning every time and really think about, okay, where do we see this company in 5 years and 10 years? And then what role do you think, and how important do we think IP is going to be, and what types of IP are going to be important? So I think that in some ways is one of the biggest challenges of this, is that there is no blueprint that you can implement that's going to work for different companies.
Really interesting. Yeah, I guess every company and use case, it must be so unique. From your vantage point, what separates great founding teams from the rest when it comes to building scalable venture-backed companies?
Well, at least what I've seen is companies that are able to have really a vision for the future. That I've seen, that a vision that kind of makes sense in some ways, but then at the same time, to really implement that vision, you have to almost have it exactly right in terms of timing, and in terms of technology timing, and how maybe even if the technology is there, whether customers are ready to accept what your vision is. And I think it's pretty, at least from what I've seen, it seems like it's very difficult to get that timing right. So sometimes companies have to pivot to something else, at least for a time. Just to give you one example, we represented a company called SanDisk for a long time. And what was really interesting about that company, which is still around, is they're really the first company in the late 1980s. Their founders had the idea for solid state disk drives. At the time, everything was a rotating disk, hard disk, and the idea that you'd be able to get the kind of density needed for, let's say, a notebook computer or a desktop computer that had a solid state memory that is kind of a transistor based memory, seemed to be very far-fetched. But that was really their vision of the future. It turned out they had some technology that was really good, but the problem was they were just too early. And so the cost wise, it didn't quite line up for that application. But they were able to pivot to be a pioneer in memory cards for digital cameras.
Interesting.
And that turned out to be a huge business. But they always maintained this vision that eventually they're going to go back into solid state disk drives. And eventually that vision came to pass. But it's almost like they had to have this other business, which turned out to be very successful. But they needed to make that leap to do solid state disk drives. They had to go kind of in a different direction for a while. And so I think being able to do that, I've seen several examples of companies that have had that flexibility to actually be able to switch and do something that's somewhat different, but makes sense, but always maintain what their overall vision is.
Yeah, that North Star. That's a really interesting story, actually, because you hear time and time again about companies that their timing of the market was bad. Like they were too early, too visionary, had to create a market as well as the technology, and then they burn through capital and it fails, right? Or they're early and then go a complete different direction, like you're talking about, which I think is more like the exception than the rule. That's probably a rarer circumstance, because especially in the startup world, you hear of so many companies that have gone the other way, or in the robotics space, right? Like they've come in, compute was too expensive, hardware was too expensive, AI wasn't doing what it's doing now, and great ideas, great applications that just didn't see the light of day properly, like they could have if they had, for example, been founded now or come around in the last sort of 3 years.
Yeah, what I would kind of suspect is maybe in the robotics space, I could see companies coming in with maybe kind of a broader vision of maybe more general purpose machines, and then they realize that it's maybe too ambitious for now, and so they go with something that's a little bit more specific to a given industry, with the idea of maybe kind of branching out later at some point using the core technology. But I think the companies that are able to do that, knowing that you're going to go in and it's not going to work out like you thought it was going to work out. But I've also seen the flip side in many of these patent cases that I work on, where a lot of the times the disputes are involving companies that didn't, let's say they weren't able to make the leaps that they were needing to make at the time. And then the company died out and maybe they were just left with a patent portfolio. And so that sometimes can be the genesis of some of these disputes.
Yeah, that's a good point, right? Because we hear about that a lot. It's like, well, we have a bunch of IP. Maybe we can license our technology, or who's going to own this, or can we sell it? Yeah, interesting. I think just on that point of pivoting or finding an area, whether it's single-use robots instead of general purpose, or however you want to look at it, but that has been something that I think investor lenses have pushed a lot of founders to think about now, because even if you have a North Star vision, even if you have like this long-term view of what your technology is going to do or the application, it's how are you going to generate revenue now? How are you going to get customers now? How are you going to get into market sooner rather than later? So having that step-by-step approach, like, hey, we're going to go in with this offering first, and this is going to be the first group of people we onboard, but eventually we're going to grow and add these modules, add these capabilities, add this functionality to get to where we want to go. So you can unlock some commercial traction, revenue, and then funding as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think one of the pitfalls that I think companies can fall in from the intellectual property standpoint with that is let's say you end up doing that. There's some pressure to maybe go into a commercial direction that allows you to get revenue more quickly. But one of the pitfalls can be companies will tend to then just focus their IP on getting protection for this one product that we have today. And sometimes the problem is, well, you should really be thinking about it more like, okay, let's think about the overall vision. So where are we going to be in 10 years from now? Because, say obtaining a patent can take a long time, and its lifespan could be 20 years from the date you file it. So you might want to think about, okay, where are we going to be in 10 years? Are we still going to be selling is our business just going to be limited to the initial, let's say, robot that we got on the market because we needed to get some revenue in years 3 or 4? Or is it going to be hopefully it'll be on something else. So maybe we want to try to get patents that we're going to cover the grander vision that we're going to have. Right. So I think that's the difficult thing to do.
Point.
But you have to be able to have this vision of the future and think about that. Usually go ahead.
I mean, I just want to double click on that for a second, because I definitely see what you're saying, and I can see it from the founder's side. So what would your advice be? Would it be 2 questions? One, it's obviously difficult to get one patent, and that takes time and obviously money and effort. Is it worth doing this overarching one that's a bigger vision that encompasses everything else? Is that even feasible? Is that possible? And then 2, like, what would your advice be? Do you do multiple for different use cases and different applications, or do you go for like this bigger all-encompassing one, if that's even possible? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing I always try to get people to do is think about it as, let's at least sit down and think critically about, hey, should we be investing in this at all, and spending money on, let's say, patents? Because maybe, for some companies, you could look at, let's say, social media technology companies. There's a lot of them that I think they probably taken the direction of, hey, we really don't need patents. They're not really going to be important in our business. Our competitors are probably not going to do it either. So let's not spend the money and time going down that path. And that can be a great decision if but it has to be a conscious decision where you really sit down and think about, hey, what's the vision of the future and how does IP mesh with that? So that's really the first decision point, but you might be in an area where, let's say, I do think robotics is a good example where I could see having a patent strategy and I could see that being very important. Then I think you'd want to think about, okay, let's look ahead 10 years. What do we think the business where are we going to fit in with the business that we think is going to evolve at that point? And then thinking about, okay, if that vision pans out the way we think it's going to pan out, what are we going to want for intellectual property? And sometimes I think a lot of times that might be, we want to try to get some overarching, detailed, let's say, patent that could potentially cover the core technologies, even regardless of what specific product they're being used in, because there's probably going to be some core technology that we have that is really what we're good at. And we want to somehow get coverage that's going to protect us on that thing that really differentiates us from other companies. That's not easy to figure. It's not easy to really figure that out. But I think going through that thought exercise is important. And I think it's a step that companies miss. I think what companies will sometimes do is just kind of say, do what the startup that I worked at was. They'll say, okay, we think we need to get some patents. So let's just give it to this guy to go out and start talking to some attorneys. And then if you don't give the attorneys or really go through this process, what will happen is the attorneys will probably say, all we can do is try to protect the product that you have or are developing. And so they'll just take what you're currently developing probably and try to get a patent on that. And that's why I'm thinking you're missing out on that more overarching strategy.
Interesting. And I guess another benefit, what you can correct me if I'm wrong, but if things do fail, or if you end up shutting the company down or whatever, and you have this patent that has the North Star vision or anything, is that worth money? Is that something that you can license? Is that still valuable in some respect?
I think it definitely could. It can be. I feel like this maybe is where I've seen a difference between what maybe the founder of the company or executives or their mindset versus, let's say, maybe the investors. Because I think from the company's, maybe the CEO, founder's perspective, hey, if we fail, like, I'm not even thinking about that. I'm trying to win, and I don't want to hear about plan B because there is no plan B. But maybe the investors are looking at it as, yes, that actually is, we've been down this road many times and we want to think about, hey, if this doesn't pan out, is there some residual value that we're going to get for this IP? And so we've had several clients where I guess where something like that has happened. It hasn't, the business hasn't worked out. But then you're at a point where, let's say the business has failed, then the founder and maybe the CEO is actually now thinking, okay, now I can think about plan B because there's nothing, the business didn't work out. So then I think there is some avenue for potentially using those, to trying to monetize them, either by licensing it or selling it. And it certainly can make the rest of the assets more valuable. So maybe there's other assets associated with the company. There's maybe the source code that was developed, maybe that the employees are going to stick around. So it could make, if you're going to end up doing an asset sale or something at the end, it could certainly make it more attractive. I mean, I think it also has there's also some, I think, developing patents. Sometimes people do it for more marketing reasons, because I think in certain segments, it can just sound good to say, hey, we have this patent covering our technology. Maybe in those cases, you're not as concerned about the quality of the patent. You just want to be able to say you have something that covers what you do, and there's some value to that. And that's I think that's a legitimate strategy. But that really gets back to that early, really thinking about where the company's going to be in the future, where IP fits in. Maybe IP fits in as just kind of a marketing thing. And if it does, then you should spend accordingly. if that's really what the risk can come out, or it can be for. I think sometimes it can help attract investors, because I
Yes.
think sometimes investors are going to, if you say, hey, I'm a technology company, and the investors say, hey, where's your let me see your patents, and you say, I don't have any. I mean, it doesn't sound like you're a technology company if you don't have, any IP you're trying to protect. So maybe they would just expect it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think that's another important reason why sometimes people do this.
Yeah, I was going to ask that from the investor standpoint, because it must make, if you're like, hey, we have IP, we have patents, we have all of this, and we have a novel way of attacking this problem, it makes you sound, at least on paper, unless you dig into that paperwork, more investable and have a unique moat as well for that industry, that problem set. And if you're looking at competitors that don't have it, you probably stand out, right?
I think so. And I think it also I think patents can create some level of transparency where you could, at least if you're doing diligence for if you're an investor, potential investor, you can at least look at that and read through the patent and make an evaluation. It can be harder if it's, we don't really have anything like that. We've never really described our technology. So maybe at that point of you have just less material that you can actually dig into and analyze. And so I think that's a negative thing. And you're right about the competitors too. I think of UCA, one thing I always would worry about is if I had a technology company, and I realized my competitors had a substantial, let's say they had invested in patents and I didn't, that asymmetry can be a recipe for disputes, I think, in the future.
Yeah, it's good advice. So in general, robotics and AI, they're moving really fast, but regulation tends to, especially with a lot of these industries, lag behind. Where do you see the biggest legal or regulatory hurdles that are coming in the next few years?
I guess it's just generally, what I would say would be the lack of certainty in things like the executive branch, for example, in the United States. If certainly there's been such big changes in terms of policies, and I think if you don't have a long-term ability to look at what are the policies of the United States in 4 or 8 years, it becomes harder to plan, or you might have to make bets about what the landscape's going to look like in 4 or 8 years from now that could be incorrect. So I think that's and for robotics, I would think that could be especially problematic because safety is such a big concern in that space. And I think with states and at the federal level, changes in regulations for safety and reporting and things like that, I think that could be a big challenge. Maybe this specific to robotics, and then AI, just changes in privacy law, and then also with AI about issues involving. There's certainly been a lot of the news about AI training, and whether that could be what aspects of it could be copyright infringement, depending on the type of, I'll say, material you're using to train different AI tools. And I think there's still a lot of legal uncertainty in that realm. And so I think that puts a lot of companies at peril, because sometimes, and maybe this is more on AI than robotics, but you might have to make a bet about, let's say, how copyright law will turn out for your business to succeed. And I think those are really difficult situations for companies, but I've certainly had clients where that they are making bets about what the landscape will look like, and that's just part of their business.
Makes sense. When startups are hiring, what should they keep in mind from a legal or structural standpoint to set themselves up for growth and compliance?
Well, one thing I always think about for companies is maybe if you could kind of avoid thinking necessarily of the lawyers you might be hiring just in terms of the discrete tasks, because I do see a lot of startup clients I've worked with or private companies where what happens is, let's say they hold off on hiring anybody in-house. They hold off on hiring an in-house attorney, which can make sense because that could be, they may want to devote the payroll resources they can to other areas for as long as they can. But then oftentimes what happens is, let's say the CEO or the CFO end up having to manage, let's say, different firms for different tasks. And one of the problems with that is there ends up being nobody who can kind of holistically be looking at the company and thinking about, hey, where are the pitfalls, not just the problems we have right now, but where are the problems we're going to have in 2 or 3 years? And what are the things that we're going to need to do to stop those potential pitfalls from manifesting into really large scale problems? And so I do think that's something that, if you can find a way to hire a general counsel, even on a part-time basis, earlier and get that person really enmeshed in the business, I think there's a lot of benefits from that. And it can also just be, I think, working with maybe, let's say you find a corporate attorney or somebody at a law firm and just really working with that person, considering them a partner in your business, letting them learn a lot about your company. I think that can also serve, to some extent, serve the same function, because then you have somebody at least thinking about, 24 hours a day, they're at least thinking about the problems you're going to be facing in the future.
I think it's so important, and yeah, we're on the same page with that. There's certain areas, from my time being internal as well as speaking to tons of founders now at the early stage, there's certain teams and certain areas within a business, they just look at like a cost center. And until it's too late, right? Legal is a key example that they can save you so much money and heartache and setbacks if you have a dedicated resource, whether it's on a fractional basis, whether it's through your firm or a full-time GC. Another one is HR, right? Like same thing. There's legal elements there. There's personnel elements. There's employment law as well. So all of these things that I don't want to say they're corners being cut, because that dollars are important to save at the early stage, and you want to put them towards your product, to your engineering. But one wrong situation is going to set you back so much more than having someone on payroll. And you don't know until it's too late, or you learn from that mistake. So,
they're usually, yeah, exactly. They could be big mistakes. They could be big, serious issues that cost way more money at the end to try to fix. I mean, a lot of the lawsuits that we have, the ones that go to trial, I feel like if you had stepped back, the companies, if they had, it can be both companies, not just let's say the plaintiff or the defendant, but both of them, if they'd both spent a little bit more time just on the high level advice that really doesn't, you're not really spending that much money or time thinking about it, but if they just spent a little bit more time on it, they could have avoided a big problem.
Yeah. So true. You've worked closely with founders as their companies scale, right, from earlier stage to larger scales, and obviously the firm's done IPOs, etc. How important is early team building, and what have you seen work best in creating strong leadership teams?
Well, certainly, and I guess I look at this sometimes from maybe the legal perspective.
Yeah.
But certainly for legal teams, I guess one thing I've noticed is the need for let's say the legal department is completely dependent on the nature of the business. So if you look at different companies, what I've seen is the legal departments look vastly, vastly different. I mean, there can be, let's say, for kind of a software as a service or SaaS type company, it may be that they have large legal teams that mostly work on, let's say, contract negotiation with customers. And that's really the lion's share of the work that they're doing. But then you could look at another company that maybe is, let's say, doing, drug discovery. I mean, that may be just patent prosecution, regulatory compliance would be the main focus. So I think what you have to do then, if you back up, is think about, okay, what's the company going to look like in the future, and then actually start with, hiring that first person, maybe the general counsel, with an eye towards what ultimately you're going to really need. So I think that's pretty interesting, because you do see people at general counsels who have very different, at different companies, they have very different backgrounds. Like sometimes it's maybe they've come from let's say you're planning, let's say your thought is, hey, we probably are going to do an IPO in 5 years. I think that first person you hire has got to be somebody who has experience going through the steps and walking through a company through like an IPO. And so maybe you hire that person as your general counsel. But I think if you have a very different vision for your company, you would hire somebody else. So I think that leadership is, you have to really jive it with the where you see the company going in 5 or 10 years.
I think the underlying theme here is, when it comes to legal, is having a North Star future vision and working towards that now from a legal standpoint, because it's great insight even from building your own legal. When I was at Hyperloop internally, I helped build their legal department, and we had a GC, and then he was like, hey, because of what we were doing there was like infrastructure, there's obviously technology, there's government. We had someone focused purely on like government and regulatory, then someone purely on contracts, and someone on real estate, and then litigation. So it was all these different areas that you could, if you were a smaller, earlier stage company with a bit in each one, have a strong GC that has some overarching experience, and partnering with a great external firm that can help you cover all of those areas. But if you are a reactive founder, sorry, this is my little jab here for founders that aren't very self-aware or very reactive, or put things like this as just like a cost center or a necessary evil. But if you're a reactive founder and you're not thinking to the future, and you're just thinking about right now, and you hire someone as like a band-aid, that's not really going to set you up for the success or the vision that you have for the future. And mirroring what you say, if you want to IPO, there's a ton you need to get buttoned up on the legal side. That takes time, that takes effort, that takes money that you need to get ahead of, instead of thinking, hey, we want to IPO next year, what do we do to get ready? It's not going to happen.
And I think the distraction too. I mean, I've had, I can remember a client where they on paper had someone who was the general counsel of a firm. This was a long time ago, but we still had to talk. We still dealt with the CEO for everything. So he was still our prince. So the problem, what I thought was, so this CEO is spending a lot of time having to manage outside law firms. And it just seemed like it's not a good, so you can look at it and say, we're spending, the cost of trying to find someone who can serve that role as the quarterback for your company and for a legal perspective, or does the CEO or CFO do it? And then what are they not able to do because they're wasting, or they're consuming time dealing with these legal issues? What's detracting them? So I think that's a big, thing for companies to think hard about, in terms of how much time do they really want these other people spending on this?
Yeah, it's a very good point. I don't think everyone thinks about it that way. Let's shift gears. I'm curious about your perspective here on future. What excites you most about the future of technology from your perspective and your legal vantage point?
Well, I do think I'm always interested in unintentional consequences of technology. So I think that's interesting. I do find it exciting, because I mean, who could have envisioned all the consequences of advancements in computers just, from, let's say, the early 1980s until today? I mean, it's really revolutionized people's lives and changed them and created problems that we never thought about before. So I think that's really interesting. I think things like robotics are interesting, because we don't even know what the unintended consequences of implementing some of these technologies could be in the future. It could be, it could be really great. Like I always thought, one thing for like self-driving cars, one thing I've always thought about is just think about if you look at a map of an urban landscape, how much land is used for storing cars, for actually storing cars in parking lots. It's usually like over 50% of the actual land that we
Is it
have.
really that much? Wow.
It, yeah, I think, I mean, look at the office I'm at, it's like,
Yeah,
40, 50% is just used for storing vehicles.
it's true.
And, for self-driving cars, well, that could change. Maybe we don't need as much storage of vehicles anymore.
Yeah,
And I think for robotics, it's really interesting because I think there's going to be aftershocks of using robots for different things that we really didn't appreciate the benefits or understand maybe the downsides to them either.
true. Yeah, that's a very good point. It gives me a lot to think about today. Thank you. If you could give one piece of advice to a first-time founder in robotics about preparing their company for long-term success, what would it be?
Well, I would probably go back to at least from an IP intellectual property perspective, I would really sit down and go through this early thought process about what do I think, you know, and I think they're doing this anyway. They have to come up with, here's the vision for the future, and then really and go out and get some advice about whether it's you could talk to attorneys, talk to maybe other founders, talk to people, like yourself, who've been at companies, and just talk to some different people about what they think would make sense for the future in terms of intellectual property, and then actually figure out what that strategy is. It's probably going to be a bet on the future, and just implement that strategy and go for it. So I think kind of that proactive thinking ahead thing. I mean, I realize there's 100 other things to think about, and this is just one of them. But it is an important. I think it is important because, at least for let's say a trade secret perspective or patent perspective, once you've released your first product, at that point it may be almost too late to go back and try to get IP protection. So you kind of have to do it before you actually release your product in many cases. So I think that's an important issue, and I think a mistake that people oftentimes make, where they push it off, understandably, because they have lots of other things to think about, but it is something to consider.
Nice. All right, before we wrap, quick bonus segment. If you weren't practicing law, what career would you choose?
Well, I recently got back into drumming,
Oh yeah.
in terms of rock drumming. Yeah. So I did it somewhat when I was a teenager, and then recently I got a drum set and got back into it. So yeah, maybe I become a professional drummer. I don't think I'm going to make a lot of money doing that, but I could try, at least for this exercise.
Yeah. Why not? If it makes you happy. um, I want to know about your dream client. If you could advise any tech pioneer, past, present, future, who would it be?
Well, I think I would say probably a future, and I think I've had kind of dream clients before, in the sense of people that I really feel like at the end of the day, I was able to help, and it made a difference for their company. And so I think that's what I think it would be a future um, uh, tech pioneer, as somebody that no one believes in, and and usually what I look for is people that I feel like I connect with and think are good people, and that also have what seems like a really interesting idea. And so I would like to help somebody like that, especially if no one else wanted to. There weren't other people that were jumping up and down to help that person, and I could make a difference.
Perfect. Well, look, Ryan, thank you so much for being on the show. Really appreciate it. Your insights, I know it's going to help a lot of people. Very eye-opening for me as well, and good stuff to think about, even when I speak to founders, and encourage them to get some legal help earlier on. How can our listeners learn more about you and Wilson Sonsini?
Sure. Well, and first of all, Greg, thank you very much for having me on the show. I do enjoy your podcast, which I've listened to many times.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
And yeah, Wilson, you can always look at our website, wsgr.com, or type Wilson Sonsini into Google, will show up. But yes, thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you. I'll link all of that in the show notes, and let's keep in touch. I'll speak to you soon.
Wonderful. Thank you, Greg.
Thanks, Ryan.